Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk by Whitney Airgood-Obrycki, who will be talking about the state of rental housing in the United States. Before we begin, just want to highlight a couple of upcoming events. Next Monday at 12:30 p.m., in person only at MIT, we're co-sponsoring a talk by Jonathan Tarleton, author of Homes for Living, which focuses on the discussions in two social housing co-ops in New York City, whose residents were both offered the opportunity to cash out, but a move that would then obviously reduce affordability and sort of how they wrestled with that. A really interesting new book. Next Tuesday at 1 o'clock, online only, we'll continue our series on issues related to people experiencing homelessness with a presentation and a panel discussion with officials from both Los Angeles and New York City who have stood up some really interesting master leasing programs as a way to provide deeply affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness or at the risk of experiencing homelessness. The following week, on Wednesday, March 19th, we'll do another book talk with Yoni Applebaum, author of Stuck, a new book looking at the ways that zoning and other land use regulation is really hindering mobility in the United States and what an important reversal that is. That'll be in person, actually at Porter Square Books in Cambridge. And then on Thursday, the 20th, our Remodeling Futures program will be releasing the biennial Improving America's Housing Report, Improving America's Housing 2025, with a really interesting panel discussion. More information about these events and other things that we are doing is available on our website and in our emails. We have a very busy schedule through the rest of March and into April until really the end of the semester in early May. So now on to today's presentation. I'm thrilled that today we will be hearing from Whitney Airgood-Obrycki, Senior Research Associate here at the Joint Center and Project Manager for our biennial America's Rental Housing Report. Whitney's going to be discussing key findings from a recent research brief she co-authored with several of our colleagues that updates that report and really examines how those trends were playing out, at least as of late last year. Whitney's going to talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then I will moderate a conversation drawing on some of the questions that we hope you'll submit through our through Zoom's Q&A feature. Please be aware that given the number of people and the time, we will almost certainly not get to all of your questions. We will share them with Whitney and her co-authors, but please put them up and we'll try and pick out the ones that seem most salient. And a couple of Whitney's co-authors will also be online answering some questions online where they can. Whitney will talk for about 30 to, as I said, for about 30 to 35 minutes. We will wrap up at about 2:30, so about an hour. Whitney, it's all yours.
Thanks, David, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to get set up here with sharing my screen. All right, I think you should all see my deck. Yeah, so thanks for the intro, David. As he mentioned, this is a brief that we released last fall called Deteriorating Rental Affordability. It's an update on the affordability chapter of our report, America's Rental Housing 2024. America's Rental Housing is a report we do every other year, at least have done every other year for the past few years. And really it covers all sorts of things about the rental market, renter households, the state of renting in the US. And so the affordability chapter really is our chance to do a deep dive on the challenges that renters face in the market, affordability being chief among them. And this was our opportunity to update that with the most recent data then. So thank you to my colleagues as well, Alex Herman and Sophia Wadeen, who helped co-author this brief. So this is the sort of headlines from the brief that I'm going to cover today. The first is that we've hit a new high for renter unaffordability. We're seeing that in a record high number of cost burden renter households. We're also seeing that affordability challenges continue to rise up the income scale and are affecting a broader range of renter households than we would have seen in the past. Cost burden disparities, though, have been persistent over time. And in particular, I'm going to touch on disparities by age and then by race and ethnicity in this presentation. Renters everywhere, though, are facing affordability challenges. We're seeing this be more ubiquitous across geographies, and a greater range of places are experiencing unaffordability for renters. And when we look at the low end of the income spectrum in particular, these lower income households, residual incomes are falling to record lows. They're having especially challenging times in this environment. And we're also seeing that the rent distribution has shifted higher over time, which is contributing to those challenges. This is especially for lower income households, threatening their household health and security over time as well. At the end, I'm going to talk briefly about where we're sort of at in the market right now to try to understand what affordability might look like going forward. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty right now, so there's a lot of question marks, but it can at least show you sort of where we're at the moment. So let's start first with this first finding that there's a new high for renter unaffordability. And I'm going to show you this first chart. I just want to talk you through it to orient you a little bit. So a lot of charts look sort of similar to this. So the dark blue in this case is severely burdened households. These are households who spend more than half of their incomes on rent and utilities each month. The light blue then includes moderately burdened. So stacked together, these are households who spend more than 30% of their incomes on rent each month. And that's what I'm going to refer to as cost burdened throughout this presentation. You'll notice that the data series here ends in 2023. That's the data that just came out last fall that we were using to update this chapter. So that's the most recent available and will be the data point I use for a lot of this. Also using 2001 as the starting point of the ACS and 2019 as our pre-pandemic mark. So if you look here, clear to the right, those two stacked bars add up to 22.6 million renter households that were burdened in 2023. And if you look slightly to the left here, past that missing tooth of the pandemic at 2019, you can see this has been a pretty big increase since the pandemic started. We've added 2.2 million cost burden renter households just over these 4 years. And if you keep looking left, you can see that things actually had been trending downward after this huge increase that the Great Recession caused. As a result of these ups and downs, though, since 2001, the number of cost burden renters has risen by a full 7.8 million households. If we focus now just on the dark blue part of these bars, you can see we're also at a record high number of severely cost burden renters, and that's at 12.1 million households. Now that's up by 1.6 million since the 2019 pre-pandemic mark, and it's up by 4.6 million over this 2-decade sweep that you see here. So that's the number of cost burden households. In terms of the share of renters who are cost burden, though, it's staying sort of just below record highs. And that's in part because we've had an increase in higher income households, and they tend to not be burdened. If you look on this chart, the blue line here is that total cost burden share, spending more than 30% of their incomes. And then orange line again is those severely burdened households. So the cost burden rate the last couple of years has been about 50% last 2 years. That's slightly below the peak in 2011 from the Great Recession. But if you compare to pre-pandemic, it's about 3 percentage points above those just before pre-pandemic levels. And it's a 9 percentage point increase over the last 2 decades. Meanwhile, the share of renters with severe burdens has also hovered sort of around 25 to 27% the last few years. Also just below the peak in 2011, but also a large increase since 2001 of about almost 7 percentage points. As I mentioned, this affordability challenge is affecting a broader range of renters, and we're especially seeing this creep up the income scale. So this should look familiar now, again, showing those severe and moderate cost burdens. This is the share rather than the count. The years we're looking at are those years I pointed out, 2001, 2019, and 2023. The categories in the x-axis are all adjusted for inflation. The incomes are adjusted for inflation before we put them in these categories to make them comparable over time. If we look at the 3 bars clear to the left, you can see that cost burdens have basically always been high at the bottom of the income spectrum, basically around 80%, even though there was another uptick during the pandemic. Then if you look at the 4th set of bars over to the right here, you can see that they're always kind of low at the top. So they've been sort of around 10%, but also increasing. As we noted, it's increasing up the income scale. So they are seeing a bit of increase for higher income renters as well. But the movement has really been in the middle. So if you look at the 2nd set of bars, those who make $30,000 to $45,000 have a cost burden rate of about 70% in 2023. This was notably a 15 percentage point increase since 2001 and a 3.5 percentage point increase just since the pandemic started. It's been an even more dramatic trend, though, for those who make $45,000 to $75,000 a year. They have a 45% burden rate at the most recent measure. That was up a pretty astounding 23 percentage points since 2001, and then about 8 percentage points over the pre-pandemic rates. These trends reflect the fact that employment increasingly does not guarantee that you are going to be able to afford rental housing. The chart here is again 2001, 2019, 2023, showing the overall cost burden rates. The x-axis here is the employment status of the householder. So we consider fully employed to be those who work at least 35 hours a week and 50 weeks of the year. And then you can see the other categories sort of step down from that until you get to full unemployment, so people who are entirely out of the labor force. So you can see from the step ladder here that employed people do have lower cost burden rates, but even so, more than a third of fully employed households were burdened in 2023. And that was an increase from about a quarter in 2001. And then, of course, as you step back employment, you get higher and higher rates. So those who are unemployed have a cost burden rate of nearly 70%. There are also certain sectors that have higher burden rates. So these are some of the industries in which people working full-time have a higher likelihood of cost burden. Again, this is the occupation specifically of the householder, and these are people who are working full-time. So more than half of renter households working full-time in personal care and service, which is, jobs like childcare fall into this, childcare workers fall into this category, or in food preparation and serving are burdened. And there are also high burden rates in sectors that are really crucial to the functioning of communities. That includes things like healthcare support, which includes home health aides, nursing assistants, pharmacy assistants, social services like social workers. And then it's not shown on the chart, but it's right up there, things like education, which includes teachers and librarians, as well as protective services like firefighters, also have very high rates that, again, just fall just off this chart. There are, of course, disparities in who experiences cost burdens, and there are lots of characteristics like age, household type, race, disability status that could affect the likelihood that a household is cost burdened. We're going to go through a few of these characteristics in the brief if you want to see more of this, and I'm just going to focus on age and race, as I mentioned. So we'll start with age. This chart should look pretty familiar now. We got our severe and moderate cost burden stack for the share. The x-axis here is the age of the householder. And related to those employment trends that I showed earlier, cost burdens are highest for the youngest renters at about 60%. These households tend to be newer to the workforce. It includes a large share of students. There's a lot of people who are single-person households. They generally tend to have lower incomes, whether from working in low-wage jobs or just being newer in experience. For people in their prime earning years, then you see as we move to the right, 25 to 54, the cost burden dips a little bit before starting to rise in older age. When you again have an increasing number of single person households, as well as people who are stepping back from work, either working part-time or retiring entirely, you get more people also who are relying on Social Security income. And as you get into these older ages, for the 65 plus group, you get to the point where the burn rate then approaches 60% again. It's of course impossible to talk about disparities in housing and housing markets without discussing race. This country has had very persistent and long-standing patterns of discrimination in education and labor that serve to depress incomes of people of color. We also see discrimination in housing markets that can additionally limit the options available. And as a result, if you look on the chart, this is again the stacked cost burden share. The x-axis here is the race or ethnicity of the householder. If you look clear to the left, you see Black and Hispanic renters in particular have a higher likelihood of being cost burdened as a result of these patterns. They have a cost burden rate of more than 50%. The white households are in the middle there. Cost burden rate's around 45%. So for Black people, it's about 10 percentage points higher. I just point out that Native Americans are shown clear on the right here. They have a relatively low cost burn rate, but of course there's significant research documenting that structural disinvestment in tribal communities often results in higher occurrence of overcrowding and substandard conditions. So just to point out that affordability is the prime challenge for a lot of renter households, but it is of course not the only challenge in housing. So while there is variation in who experiences burdens, we're seeing a growing geography of the places that are struggling with rising cost burdens. And as I mentioned, it's just becoming more ubiquitous and more nationwide. This is a map of the cost burden rate by state. And you can see the really dark blue are the places where more than half of renters are burdened. In every single state, more than a third of renter households are cost burdened, and 43 states have seen increases in their burden rate since the pandemic started, including 16 that saw their rate increase by at least 4 percentage points. I'm going to just highlight those places with really high burden. So in 13 states, more than half of renter households were burdened in 2023. Those are largely in the West where housing costs tend to be higher, but also in the South where housing costs are low, but incomes are also low. There are a few states that are relatively more affordable, where rents are slightly more in line with renters' income. So the 4 that are shown here at least have rates that are under 40%. If you look on the contiguous US, that's North and South Dakota, and then Wyoming there. They also had some of the largest decreases since the start of the pandemic. And then down on the bottom of the map, you can also see Alaska as one of these relatively more affordable places where rents and incomes are more in line. But again, even in these more affordable states, you can see they have a renter cost burden rate of at least 36%. So it's not like anywhere is truly, super affordable. A similar story plays out at the metro level. So on the map, I'm showing the 100 most populous metros. If you look at these collectively, the cost burden rate for all renters across all these metros is about 51%. On the map in particular, the blue shades are metros where less than half of renters were burdened in 2023. And then the orange shades are places where more than half of renters were burdened. So if we look just at the orange, that's half of all major metros have burden rates over 50%. Those metros are generally located in the South and West, which again follows those state patterns that we just saw. If you take a look at Florida, the metros in Florida are topping the list for unaffordability for renters, though. The dark orange is Cape Coral and Miami, where cost burden rates are over 60% for the full renter population. But if you look at Orlando, Northport, Tampa, and sort of that mid-orange, those are also right up there in sort of the high 50s, around 58 or 59%. You can also look at the places that are more affordable. This is showing all the metros where less than half of renters are cost burdened. The lower cost burden rates are fairly common in Midwestern metros that extends into the Rust Belt, sort of in the Northeast. But still the lowest burden rate across all these metros is 42% at the minimum. So that's the rate in Des Moines, Wichita, and Pittsburgh. So these are, of course, just the large metros, and you can see there's a lot of gray on this map, right? So cost burdens do tend to be lower in metros with smaller populations, and then rural areas have the lowest cost burden rate of all. But even there, it's nearly 40% of rural renters that are cost burdened. I should also note too that if you're a lower income renter, no place is affordable. So here's the metro map again. These are the burden rates for lower income renters. And because there's variation in metro incomes, what I'm doing here is I take each metro, I use the distribution of all household incomes, including owners, and calculate the bottom fifth of incomes. And then I take any renters who fall into that category and consider them to be lower income. This is simply to show that there are more than 3/4 of lower income renters that are cost burdened in every single major metro of the country. And you can see from those darker orange shades that the rate exceeds 85% in a lot of places. Even in rural areas, those more affordable places, 72% of lower income renters were burdened in 2023. So just to reiterate, draw a really fine line under it is nothing is even close to an affordable geography if you are lower income. And in fact, lower income households have always faced the steepest affordability challenges, and those challenges are only growing as we've seen their residual incomes have fallen to a record low. I just want to take one step back though and start with the overall rent and income trends over time, just to get a sense of how things have moved. So on this chart, I'm showing the percent change in each indicator since 2001. The blue line is the median gross rent, which includes utilities. The orange line is median household income, and that's just for renters. And everything is adjusted for inflation, so this is a change in real terms. What this is showing is that from 2001 to 2023, the median rent increased 25%, while incomes increased by just 5%. And that difference between incomes and rents has just widened since the start of the pandemic. You can see that gap that's opened up even more in 2023 there. For lower income households, they've really been hit the hardest though. And for households who make less than $30,000, rent increased by 18% in real terms, while incomes actually fell by 12%. And what's underlying some of this rent trend is the fact that the whole rent distribution has shifted higher over time, which reflects both the loss of low rent units at the bottom end, as well as the high cost of new construction that we're adding at the high end. The years are a little different on this chart. We have 2013 as a starting point, and then 2019 and 2023. The x-axis here is contract rent, which excludes utilities but allows us to include vacant units. So if you look clear to the left on these, first three chunks of bars, the net losses have all been among units renting for less than $1,000, a total of 7.5 million units less than what we had in 2013. That includes a loss of 2.5 million units that rent for less than $600, and an additional 2.5 million units that rent for $600 to $800. As a result of this shift, the share that rent for less than $1,000 fell from 57% of the rental stock in 2013 to just 37% of the rental stock in 2023. Meanwhile, if we look clear to the right, those last two groups, net additions have all been at the high end among units that rent for more than $1,400. That included an increase of 5.5 million units that rent for at least $2,000 a month, which now make up about a fifth of the stock. If you compare that to 2013, in 2013, just 8% of the stock rented for $2,000. So we're seeing a very rapid shift toward the higher end. But incomes haven't shifted in line with rents. So as a result of these trends, renters are spending an increasing share of their incomes on housing. This chart is showing the median, basically cost to income ratio. So the median share of household income that's going to rent and utilities each month. The income categories here again are adjusted for inflation. If you look clear to the right, this is all renter households. It shows that the median renter now spends 31% of their income on rent, which is up from 27% in 2001. But lower income renters have seen the largest jump in these cost to income ratios. So if you look clear to the left, they spent 60% of their incomes on rent at the median in 2001 on that purple bar. It's risen up to 80% in 2023 on that orange bar. And that's left lower income renters with less left over than ever before. This is again the change in the indicator since 2001. This is all in real terms again. This is showing the median amount of income that these households have left over after paying rent each month, as expressed as a percent change since 2001, right? So lower income households had 55% less after paying rent in 2023 than they did in 2001. That's that orange line that you see just taking a deep dive. There was a huge drop just during the pandemic alone, a drop of about 44%. Middle income households, shown on that blue line, had a drop of about 10% over this longer period. And then higher income households are making out about even as compared to 2001 with just a slight increase. So the percent change is a little bit abstract. What does this mean in terms of like actual amounts? Well, lower income households had very little to start with, and now their margins are even tighter at the same time that the cost of everything else is going up. So the cost of food, the cost of energy, a lot of other costs have gone up over this period of time. If you look clear to the left, you see the small amount that lower income households have left over. It dropped to $250 a month for 2023. I think this chart also highlights that while cost burdens have risen up the income scale, higher income households, especially those making $75,000 or more, those really tall bars here, they have more cushion to absorb higher housing costs. But even so, these rising rents are cutting into middle and higher income households' spending power for other goods and services, which of course has other effects on local economies. For lower income households especially, there are these very real trade-offs that result from paying too much for housing, and that threatens their household health and security. I'm going to show you two examples of the types of trade-offs that we see in the data. So the first comes from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. We use a couple of proxies here, so I just want to explain what's happening. So this is the monthly expenditures for renters who are in the bottom spending quartile, which we use as a proxy for low-income renters. And then in this case, we're talking about severely burdened households as those who spend more than half of their expenditures on housing, and unburdened is 30% or less on housing. So if you look at the chart, severely burdened households here spent about half the amount on food and healthcare as their unburdened counterparts. They spent about 38% less on retirement. The other area where we see trade-offs is in how people approach their energy bills, which are a major housing cost for a lot of households and cause a lot of strain on household budgets. This comes from the Census's Household Pulse Survey, and it's part of the survey that was fielded through August of last year. These are the share of renter households who said that they did these activities at least some months of the year. And the blue bar are those lower income households, in this case, who make less than $25,000 a year. The purple is all renters, just for reference. So among lower income households, if you look at the first blue bar on the left, 42% reduced spending on basic necessities like food or medicine just to be able to pay their energy bill. In the middle, just over a quarter of these low income households kept their home at an unsafe temperature as a way to reduce energy consumption and reduce the cost of energy. And then on the far right, nearly a third could not keep up with their energy bills and missed a full payment at least some months of the year. So as you might expect, these trade-offs have substantial effects on the physical, mental, and financial health and well-being of renters, and can create these really compounding problems over time. Ultimately, though, like some households can make all the trade-offs they want, and they just aren't going to be able to make rent. Especially among lower income households, we found last year that 17% reported that they were behind on rent. 7% felt pressure to move because they'd missed a rent payment. And then 5% were actually threatened with eviction or their landlord had asked them to leave. So those percentages might seem sort of small, but when you multiply that out, that's hundreds of thousands of renter households, and they're facing this really deep form of substantial, really deep and substantial housing insecurity. So a lot of the data, except for the last slide, has been using 2023 as the point of reference. So can we bring it up to current events and try to understand what the outlook for affordability is? And as with everything right now, there's a lot of uncertainty that makes it a little bit difficult, but I'm going to share sort of some good news and probably what is closer to the bad news. So the good news is that there is a lot of momentum at the state and local level for addressing affordability challenges. I think there's this growing awareness that this is a huge problem. It's affecting a larger number of people, larger range of people, really just nationwide. And there's also been a willingness to try new approaches, in some places to think creatively about funding sources, about development models, about regulations that can be changed to make this more possible. And there's just really this importance on increasing increasing construction across the country. So allowing more construction to happen and more types of construction to happen. What we've seen in the last few years is a lot of multifamily construction, and completions, which are shown here, has been really, really high. So we have more than 600,000 units that were completed in 2024. And I'm using for multifamily, these are buildings with at least 2 units. This was a significant increase from those pre-pandemic levels. You can see there were about 350,000 or so completed units per year pre-pandemic. New construction has been beneficial. It's slowed the rise in asking rent so that year-over-year growth in professionally managed apartment sector, which covers about a third of all rental units, has been essentially flat for the last year and a half. In the markets that are tracked underlying this number, about a third have had actual decreases in asking rents, which is a very different situation from what we saw in previous years. A lot of those markets are in the South and the West. I'm sure you've seen Austin in the news as being one of the most notable examples of those large rent decreases. So for what is sort of the bad news in terms of renter affordability, demand is more in line with completions, which can put upward pressure on rents. And so on this chart, this is again the professionally managed apartment sector. The blue line is the net number of new renter households. The orange line is the net number of completions. And basically what we're seeing is we had a huge net increase in renter households in 2021 going into early 22. Construction was just kind of chugging along at normal levels. And so that pushed rents up very, very quickly. And then we had a really, pretty substantial drop in demand, gave markets a little bit of a chance to catch up, supply a chance to catch up, helped us get back to that flat rate of rent growth. But demand has once again just absolutely skyrocketed and has overtaken that supply line, as you can see. So that's definitely a scenario that can put upward pressure on rents. Construction is also slowing pretty quickly. So we've had an environment of high interest rates, a lot of rising operational costs like taxes and insurance, as well as the slowing rent growth that we just mentioned. It's all cooled construction and contributed to this big drop in permits, which is on the blue line here. You can see that peak and then the sharp decrease, and then in starts, which is on that orange line. That just puts fewer projects into the start of the pipeline, and that could mean that there's going to be more upward pressure on rents as we go forward. The big thing, though, is that there is just a lot of uncertainty right now around things that could either become or continue to be headwinds for affordability and for construction. I'm putting this up just as an illustration. This is just like a super quick text analysis, so it hasn't been fully fact checked, so take it with a grain of salt, I guess. But these were just mentions of uncertainty in the February beige books that the Fed puts out, and they just use that to characterize sort of economic conditions on an anecdotal level. And you see the mentions of uncertainty have gone way up this year. I'm frankly glad that I am not a forecaster for my job because the uncertainty is just off the charts. It's hard to know what to do with it. And so I think right now, some of the big questions that would affect housing are around sort of the extent and duration of tariffs that could increase the cost of construction materials. Lots of questions about immigration policy and how that would reduce the construction labor force, which would then also increase the cost of labor for construction. Lots of questions about where interest rates are headed. We never know how many disasters might be in store for us. And if we look at the LA wildfires that wiped out thousands of homes, which has an effect on rents. We also are facing, the potential for greater unemployment and lapses in or cuts to the social safety net, which almost certainly would worsen the affordability challenges that we see. And then in addition, if inflation remains high, there's just going to be a lot more trade-offs that households have to make and a lot more potential for housing insecurity or other types of insecurity. So all that to say, we learn more every day, but we're definitely coming into this period of uncertainty and sort of likely headwinds with record high unaffordability. And that's going to be really difficult to turn around without these really concerted efforts and without policy support for this. So again, I want to thank Alex and Sophia. Thank you all for being here and for being interested in this topic and wanting to learn more. Our brief is up on our website, jchs.harvard.edu. I think someone also probably dropped a link in the chat, and I'm happy to answer a few questions. So thank you so much.
Whitney, thank you. Really a remarkably clear. I was struck at the end. There's an old quote which is usually mistakenly attributed to Yogi Berra. I don't know who said it. I know he didn't. That it's very difficult to make predictions, particularly about the future. And this does. It is your note on uncertainty is really striking. Let me start actually with a method question. Several people in the Q&A asked about how you handle people who are on either in rental assistance in public housing, so who have whose rents are subsidized. And if you I know you've done some other work on that, so maybe if you could just clarify that and also perhaps remind us of what share of people who are eligible actually get that assistance.
Yeah, so there's something like 44 to 45 million renter households in the country. There are about 5 million who receive some kinds of assistance based on the HUD Worst Case Housing Needs Report, the most recent one. So it's a relatively small share of renters. I'll start with that. In the ACS, it asks renters to report their monthly rent, and people interpret the question very differently. And I think depending on the subsidy, you also might answer that question differently. If you're in public housing, you're most likely to just put the amount that you pay in rent. And so it's already sort of factoring in the subsidy for you. And it's going to show that you're probably not cost burdened then, right? For people who receive vouchers, it's a little muddier, like what the question actually is and how you might respond to it. So in general, it seems like respondents are putting the amount that they pay, and so it's reflecting sort of true cost burden, but there is some variation that based on the subsidy and based on how people interpret the question. For those who are really into like the technical details, there is a really great, I think, census working paper that uses administrative data to explore how people answer that question based on the different subsidy that they receive. It's a pretty interesting but kind of wonky paper.
And can you help perhaps unpack the data on the formation of renter households is quite striking. I mean, we saw a jump at the beginning of the pandemic, a drop. What is driving, as best you can figure, the growth in renter households that is creating such a demand?
So the first sort of pandemic spike, which we do have sort of census data on and can pull apart, when we looked at it in the last rental report, we found that it was a lot of smaller households and actually a lot of lower and middle income households, which was sort of a different trend from what we had been seeing previously in the previous 10 years, where growth was almost entirely driven by higher income households. I suspect that a lot of that came from the fact that we were in a pandemic and maybe it was more desirable to go live on your own instead of with a whole bunch of roommates. And there's this brief moment in the pandemic where things really cooled and there were these opportunities where you could, maybe strike out and form a new household. And so it did seem to come from these smaller households in lower and middle income. Going into 2023, it looks like it's more higher income households again, possibly people who are being shut out of home ownership. Seems like a likely source of some of the rental demand.
And presumably this is also a function of just the millennial generation being,
Yeah, there's certainly some demographics
yeah,
underlying
yeah.
it as well. Millennials and older adults too, who sometimes shift to renting as they get older.
Yeah. Um, More of a kind of a big picture question, and I'm going to try and combine, I think, two questions that are put with flip side. One is just why? Why isn't the market responding to the need for more affordable housing? And the flip of that is why is it that basically it is so expensive to build housing, and so everybody is basically building at the high end?
The cost of construction materials has risen really quickly, and it's very expensive to build new units. The cost of labor is very high. There's a labor shortage in the construction industry. Uh, there are elongated timelines in some cases because of the regulations around permitting processes. There's also, land is becoming more scarce, it's becoming more expensive. So when you start to look at all of the inputs in addition to the longer timelines, that all adds up to not being able to really create market rate affordable housing. You need some kind of subsidy to offset that. A lot of places are looking into regulatory reforms because that's maybe a lower, no cost way to help speed things up, to streamline permits, to make more, different kinds of land available. The zoning reforms like we just saw here in Cambridge is just to sort of unlock the potential to be able to build different types of units and potentially, build at higher densities that could make things pencil out a little better. But really, when the cost of all of the inputs are going up and you're trying to serve a population, that might only be able to afford $600 a month, it's really hard to do that without some kind of subsidy.
Are you seeing impacts of some of those changes, some state level, some local level, on either supply or actual rents, or is it still too early to tell?
I think there are some studies out there you can see like the effects of upzoning generally are showing a positive impact. I think it gets a little bit more murky when you're looking at the actual affordability and whether it's bringing things down enough to actually meet the renters who have the deepest affordability challenges. There's one paper that even shows that there is potentially an amenity effect of new construction that would lead to higher rents in like Class C properties where lower income households tend to live. So I think the evidence is still coming out as there are more and more zoning changes made and that we start to see sort of these longer timeline effects. But a lot of the evidence so far is positive that, these sort of like housing abundant policies do have a positive effect on either slowing rent growth or actually bringing rents down. Certainly seems to be the case in like Austin, where they've just had a flurry of construction and now rents are really, coming down on the asking rent end of things.
Hmm. Are you seeing this is I know it's a little bit beyond the scope of the brief, but we're getting a bunch of questions about the impact of investor activity. Um, and I guess sort of two parts of that. Can we say anything about just the change in ownership generally of rental units,
Mhm.
and then any sense of what that might or might not, what do we think we know or don't know about how that is actually impacting rents?
Yeah, I think that's that's a focus of a lot of studies right now. One of the challenges that looking nationally is challenging, and that a lot of this activity is actually concentrated in certain metros and certain markets. Um, I think one of the issues is that it creates competition with home buyers, right? And so that's one challenge in the affordability piece. For renters themselves, I don't know that we have empirical evidence, or maybe I don't know of it or have it off the top of my head on what it actually does in terms of increasing rents if you have that sort of investor. Conceptually, you would think that if you have investors, you have some sort of return that you have to make for shareholders. And so there might be more incentive to raise rents and to keep that upward pressure on rents. But I don't know that I have seen a comprehensive empirical study myself on like the, cause effect of more investors in a neighborhood. There certainly, has been evidence of the potential that investors result in higher evictions and maybe some other outcomes that are not necessarily good for renters. But yeah, on the one hand, you might say you have a more professionalized management and you have, mom and pop landlords who might not be very good at that, but also there's some evidence that, these investor owners are also going to have negative outcomes for renters.
A couple questions about the impact of the supposition that insurance, property insurance for the owners of rental properties has gone up, and how that may or may not be affecting affordability. Again, I know this is a little bit beyond the brief, but I also know
Yeah.
how much you pay attention to the literature. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on what we're seeing.
Yeah, there have definitely been huge increases in property insurance. It's cutting into, the ROI for the return on investment for property owners. It's a big cost, right? And it's gone up pretty rapidly as it has for homeowners as well. Those costs, it does cut into the ROI, but it also sometimes gets passed on to renters. And so that's going to be baked into some of the rent increases as well. They're going to be trying to cover increasing costs. So uh again, I don't think I've seen an empirical like
Mhm.
this is how much in particular rising property, either insurance or taxes are feeding into rents, but it's almost certainly getting passed to renters in some form.
Hmm. Circling back, there were some folks who were intrigued by your findings about, at least on the rental side, the affordability in rural areas were somewhat more affordable, although, as you pointed out, still a lot of cost burden renters. But then some questions saying, what happens if you factor in some of the other impacts of particularly things like transportation costs, other other costs? Does it sort of wash out in terms of cost of living, residual income?
Yeah, we have a paper hopefully coming soon, hopefully the next month or so. That is an update on a previous residual income paper that we did. The first one was called Rent Eats First. I think this one is going to be called Rent Eats More. And we're basically again trying to calculate the number of households, renter households who have residual income burdens, which means that they, after paying for housing, cannot afford all other basic necessities. Um, in that paper, we do more geographic breakdown than we did in the first paper. So hopefully people can look forward to that. One of the super interesting findings I thought this time was we did this sort of similar breakdown by metro sizes and then rural areas and calculated the residual income burden rate and find that it really like flips the affordability story on its head. That the places where you have larger metros or even, smaller sized metros have lower residual income burdens, and then it rises as you get to the rural places. So rural areas actually have a higher cost burden rate for residual incomes. And that really speaks to the fact that these are, lower income places. The housing cost isn't that high, but the cost of everything else sort of has some kind of floor to it, right? And so even though the housing is more affordable, it's still harder for people to meet a basic standard of living and to cover all of those costs when you just have low incomes. I'm really excited about that paper and sharing it with everyone. So I hope we get out soon. I hope people will read it.
And who
It's an
knows,
interesting measure and an interesting way to think about how geographically widespread different kinds of affordability challenges are.
I was really I've always been really struck by the residual income calculations that that we've done, and trying to think about what does that look like for households, and it picks up on some questions of folks saying, are there good examples of narrative accounts that basically put a human face on what does this mean, or more
Mhm.
detailed close studies of the kinds of choices that households make. I don't know if you run across any of that you would commend to folks who really want to understand and appreciate the what that data is telling us.
It's slightly older at this point, but not too old. But the book, I think it's called The Financial Diaries, is a just absolutely wonderful book. Really sort of a sociological account of how lower income families manage their income over a year, right? And manage sort of the boom and bust of when income comes in, how they manage different trade-offs, how they think about their household budgets, really sophisticated navigation of consumer spending and sophisticated navigation of sort of our just like government systems. It's a wonderful book. It's a great read, and I just think it's super insightful into how this actually plays out on the ground.
And if memory serves, that's actually pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
So whatever it was describing has just gotten from the data you've put out, um, gotten so much worse. Um, Question about shifting gears, as we often do here. The data, the Pulse survey data was quite striking about the share of households reporting struggles paying rent, pressure to move. Wondering if we've seen. I know the eviction data is really hard to parse, but is that showing up in actual eviction data or in some of the other data about moves that people make?
Yeah, it's hard to do sort of a one for one, right? And some of the eviction data is a little bit more patchy, whereas the Household Pulse survey tries to be, more sort of nationally representative. Um, 5% eviction is fairly high for a nationwide metric. But if you look in like certain, neighborhoods in certain states, it's maybe par for the course. It's yeah, so I don't have a good answer for that, I suppose. It's one of the few nationwide surveys of what people report, and some of it is like, have you been threatened, right? And so I think an important question is like there's have you been threatened, and then have you actually had to move? But even the fact that you've been threatened, I think can cause real insecurity in different ways, and can make you adjust your behaviors. And so I think even that metric of like have you been threatened or asked to leave is still an important metric, even if it doesn't necessarily translate into okay, a household actually moved.
Right, right. Or, as we know from Matt Desmond's work, there are a lot of households that move that never go through the eviction
Yes,
process.
exactly. Yep.
Uh, yeah. Uh, I was struck, and I don't know if you've done these calculations. This whole rise of higher income renters has been something that has been striking all along. And I think you suggested earlier that, part of that were, I guess it's that trade-off of, as rents rise, one might think that folks begin to say, well, maybe it's home ownership. And I don't know to what extent you have been looking at the data of how do the increases in rents compare to the increases in home prices. So is it that people are just being, you can pick either fork in the road, but both of them are going to be troublesome.
I think that's true. I saw some data recently that suggested that the gap between the two was sort of closing, and so maybe being a renter isn't such a bad financial strategy in some respect. Certainly, like there are risks to home ownership right now. The property insurance is a big one, rising taxes is a big one, same, that multifamily owners are seeing. The high mortgage rates though, and just the ability to save for a down payment is a really steep barrier for a lot of households right now, which is why we might see more higher income renters. And then as you're paying an increasing share of your own income on rent, you also have less ability to save for the down payment, right? So it's sort of this like a cycle that is difficult and makes it hard to even break into homeownership for a lot of us. Um, there's another branch too where renting gives you a lot of options now, right? Like you can have a single family home that you rent that's newer. Um, like me, you might live in a city in a really walkable, nice neighborhood. Like there are different options for renting now too that may be also drawing people to the rental market and keeping them longer as well.
You prompt a question about what do we know about the location of the newer of the newer rental units?
Yeah, primarily in urban, urban core counties. I think we usually use counties for the new
Mhm.
permits, and a lot of them have been there in the last decade. Um, we also sometimes look at data that there's more amenities in rental homes, and certainly the built for rent, single family rental sector is really big right now. And so just more options available, right? If you have a dog, you can rent and have a backyard, right? Like it's sort of a different world than what we might have had in previous generations.
Interesting. Just to wrap up, as you kind of reflect on this, I guess two things. Was there anything in particular that really surprised you as you sort of dug through this data? Um, and I guess the other thing is there anything that, and I think I know the answer to the second half of this question, that especially, that you think is especially concerning, that you want to make sure people, we've just gone over a bunch of topics, but what are the things that you think we really should be paying the most attention to? So both surprises
Yeah.
and concerns.
So I'll say when I first ran some of the post-pandemic numbers on residual income, even on the cost burden counts, I ran those a couple of times because at first I like knew things were bad, but couldn't like sort of couldn't believe that it would show up in the data like that bad. Especially that drop in residual income for lower income households. Um, so that number has definitely been fact checked a few times and run a few times because I looked at that chart and thought like, how is that even possible? So the way that things have shifted so quickly with the pandemic and just the speed at which things happened over those years, I think is still kind of astonishing to me. Um, and the fact that it has, continued through the 2023 data to still show up, I think was sort of surprising in some ways. I I look at these data all the time, and every single time I feel like the human cost of it, right? Like that's always what sort of grounds me in it. The struggles that lower income households have, the ways that they navigate these systems, the way that they navigate our economic system is just, it's absolutely incredible. It's terribly sad. It shouldn't have to be this way in some ways, right? Like, um, I hope that people take away that we all we all deserve to have a healthy and affordable home to live in. That's the key to everything else in life, right? And so I think especially for these lower income renters, these are always the people that I am thinking about, that I hope we support policy for, and that, we always keep in mind as we're thinking about how do our policy decisions affect everyone.
I think it's an important place to end, and it really made me come back to I really just want to appreciate and give a shout out to you and your colleagues, for digging deep into the data and really pulling out some very important and, as you point out, really potentially distressing trends, and reminding us in very clear and eloquent language what that actually means. I want to thank you. You'll see when we put out the questions that many people, I think, really appreciated the just the clarity with which you presented a huge amount of data. I do want to remind folks that Whitney's slides and a video of this presentation will be posted on the Joint Center website early next week. And of course, the paper that Whitney was drawing on is already on our website and was left in the chat. And you won't be able to hear all those people clapping, but I hope everyone online will join me in thanking Whitney and her colleagues for just a terrific and important piece of work. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon and enjoys the coming of daylight savings time. Have a great day, everybody.